Welcome to Season 2 of Taylion's Career Cafe podcast. I'm Edward.
And I'm Envy. On this episode, we'll be talking to a leader in the High Desert community.
Not only is he our assemblyman for our district, but he is also the president of Farside Studios, a video game company based in Big Bear. Please welcome
Jay Obernolte. What is an assemblyman?
Well, the state of California has a legislature that is bicameral, which means it has two houses. The upper chamber is the Senate, and the lower chamber is called the Assembly. So there are 80 assembly districts and 40 Senate districts. So an assemblyman is the representative for roughly 1/80th of California in the lower house of the California State Legislature.
Oh, that's an important job. It really is. What made you want to be an assemblyman?
Well, I kind of got into public service through a hobby of mine. I enjoy flying light airplanes, and I'm a flight instructor.
Oh, really?
Just recreationally. And so I have been a tenant at our little airport in Big Bear for the last 24 years. And about 15 years ago, I was asked to run for a seat on the airport board of directors. And our airport is a California special district, which means that if you want to be on the board of directors, you have to run in an election and be elected by the people. And so I had to learn how to campaign and put up signs and try and get people to vote for me. And so I was elected to that board, and that led to a whole career for me in public service. So I served 5 years on that board, 3 terms as president. And when I was done at the airport, there was an open seat on our city council. So I ran for city council and was elected, served 4 years there, ran for mayor, was elected mayor, served 2 terms as mayor, and then 4 years ago ran for the state assembly.
Wow, that's a long journey.
But I never set out to be here. It just kind of happened.
As an assemblyman, what are your responsibilities?
Well, that's actually a really good question, because when you get elected to the legislature, no one hands you a booklet that says, okay, here's what you're supposed to do. So we all have to figure out for ourselves what it means to be an effective representative of the people. So at the very least, we have to be on the legislature floor when the legislature is in session, and that's from the beginning of January through the middle of September most years. So the legislature will meet on Mondays and Thursdays usually, so I have to be in Sacramento for those sessions, and we vote on legislation, bills we call them, that are brought before the Assembly. In addition to that, we serve on legislative committees. So I'm the vice chair of the Assembly Budget Committee. I also serve on the Committee for Appropriations. I'm on what we call JLAC, which is the Joint Legislative Audit Committee. I also sit on the Budget Conference Committee. So anything to do with money in Sacramento, I'm deeply involved in. But in addition to that, I oversee a staff. So I have staff in Sacramento that helps with all of the legislation that we author. And I also have a district office here in Hesperia filled with people who have a heart for constituent service. So our job is to represent the people that live in my district before the state government. So sometimes we have disputes and problems that occur with state government, like the Franchise Tax Board will say that you have a tax debt and you disagree, or the Department of Motor Vehicles refuses to register a vehicle and you think that there's been an error, or you can't get a cosmetology license because they don't have your correct address, things like that.
Yeah.
And so our job is to help our constituents solve those problems.
So, what exactly is your district?
My district is the 33rd Assembly District. As I said, the state of California is divided up into 80 assembly districts, and the way it works is that every time there's a census, and there's one coming up in 2020, they figure out what the total population of the state is, and then they divide by 80 to figure out how many people should be in each assembly district. So this population of the state right now is about 40 million people. So I represent about 500,000 people.
That's a lot of people.
It is. And so what they do is they try and draw the district boundaries to encompass almost exactly that number of people. So what happens is when you have a densely populated urban area like Los Angeles or San Francisco, the assembly districts are very compact geographically. But when you have low population density, as we do here, then the districts get very large. So my district is the second largest district in California. It starts in the mountains to the south of us, so I represent the mountain communities of Big Bear Lake, Lake Arrowhead, Crestline, and Running Springs. I represent all of the high desert, so I represent Victorville, Adelanto, Hesperia, Apple Valley. And then my district goes all the way north to Nevada, so I represent Barstow, Trona, Baker, are all areas that I represent. And then my district goes all the way east to Arizona and the Colorado River. So Needles is my eastmost city.
That's pretty far.
It's very large. It takes me, on a good day, maybe 5 hours to drive across it in one direction.
Oh,
And to give you an example of how unusual that is, I'm the vice chair of budget. The chairman of budget, Phil Ting, represents an area of downtown San Francisco. He can drive across his district in about 10 minutes.
oh wow.
Do you enjoy being an assemblyman?
I do. It is really the hardest job I've ever had in my life, if you take it seriously, and I think most of us do. But it's also a very fulfilling job because you have the opportunity to make people's lives better. And that's something that I really enjoy doing.
That's nice.
So I got a question here for you that's not on here. What kind of obstacles do you face in the sense of being an assemblyman?
Well, there are different types of obstacles. I mean, there's always the obstacle of getting elected, and we have to run for election a lot. The assembly is meant to be the people's house. So if we do something that displeases the people that elected us, they're meant to have an early opportunity to choose someone else to do our job. So we have to stand for re-election every 2 years. Our terms are only 2 years. And unlike a lot of elected positions, we have to run in both a primary election and a general election. So we have 2 elections every 2 years. So if you focus on that part of your job, it'll drive you crazy because you feel like you're always campaigning. So that's one obstacle. There's also legislative obstacles because we don't always agree on what California ought to look like and where we're going and how to get there and what the biggest problems are with our society and what are appropriate problems to be solved by government. So those are the debates that occur in the legislature. And so when we author legislation, and I author a lot of legislation, I author at least 20 bills every year,
That's a lot.
then I have to argue those bills in front of committee and try and convince a majority of my colleagues that my bill is meritorious and deserves to be passed. So we've had a lot of success with doing that. This year, I was able to get 15 of my bills passed by both the Assembly and the Senate. And then they go to the governor for approval, and he signed 12 of them and vetoed 3. So
That's pretty impressive.
it was really it was a lot of work, but I was really excited to be able to get that done.
It's something to be really proud of.
Why did you choose to do video games?
Well, I always enjoyed playing video games, and when I started playing them, they weren't like you would imagine video games are now. The only way to play a video game was when I was your age was either to go to an arcade. Or if you had a home computer, you could buy a book, and it would have all the code for a game. And if you typed in all the code and then debugged it, because we always made mistakes when we typed it in, and then you could run it and play the game. But we had no way of storing the code, and so you'd have to, when you wanted to play the next game, you'd have to clear the memory of the computer and type in the next one. So it wasn't clear that one could make a living writing video games because it was in the infancy of the industry. So I wrote educational software when I was in high school. My first educational software title was published. And I started writing more educational software to make money when I was in college. So I worked for textbook manufacturers like Addison Wesley and Scott Forsman. So when I was at Caltech working on my bachelor's degree, I saw an advertisement in our computer science department looking for someone who was an expert at a certain microprocessor. And I said, oh wow, that's the microprocessor that I wrote my laboratory software on. And so I answered the ad, and it turned out to be a company that was working with this firm in Japan that no one had ever heard of before in America. And they had this weird name. They called themselves Nintendo.
Oh.
And they were just about to introduce their first game machine in North America, the Nintendo Entertainment System. And it used the same microprocessor that I was familiar with. And so I started working with Nintendo, writing some of the first games for the NES, we called it. And that led to a whole career for me writing video games. But I didn't think at the time that it would be something that I could actually make money as an adult. In fact, I remember talking to my mother, and she said, I told her that I was writing video game software, and she said, well, honey, that's nice, but wouldn't you rather do something that you could actually turn into a career? So I got the last laugh on that one.
Yeah, you did.
You did.
So how did you get started? Oh, you already told us that, but I'll ask it anyways. How did you get started in the video game industry? It's this reoccurring question.
Well, so at the beginning, when I wrote games, it was just me. I did not just the game design and the computer programming, but also the art, the animation, the sound, I'm embarrassed to say I did the music. It's not really my forte, but it was very simple back then. It was possible for one person to write an entire game. But as the game machines got more sophisticated, and I started wrote for the Super Nintendo, and then for the Sega Genesis, and then I started working on the PlayStation 1, the original one.
Wow.
And as the games got more sophisticated, I needed people to help me do the things that I wasn't as good at doing. And so when I got a contract to do a new game, I would call all of my friends that I'd worked with before, and I'd subcontract out different pieces of it, and we'd collaborate via telephone and email. And so that's how that was the beginning of my company, Farsight Studios, was just I needed a company entity to be able to put on these contracts. Yeah. But then when I was in graduate school, something happened that changed my whole life, and that's that one of the games that we had written for the Sega Genesis, a game called NFL 95, it was published by Sega Sports, it went platinum, as we say in the industry, meaning it sold over 1 million copies.
Wow.
And that really changed things for us because it meant that we had a steady stream of income if we could keep doing hits. That we could actually be a viable company, and so I leased an office and hired people on as employees, and we still do it now. This has been almost 30 years we've been in business, and I have 28 employees right now at our studio in Big Bear Lake. We do development for PlayStation 4, Xbox One, Nintendo Switch, all the consoles. But we also do about half of our revenue now on mobile platforms like iPhones and Android phones and tablets. So it's been really interesting to be in the industry that long to see all the changes that have occurred.
That's really crazy.
And what kind of work is needed, what kind of education is needed to work at your studio?
Well, it's interesting. Video games have really evolved, and there are different specialities in games now. So the preparation that one would need to be a video game designer is very different from what you'd need to be a programmer, and that's very different from what you'd need to be an animator. So typically our employees have a 4-year degree. So in the case of like engineers, computer programmers, they'll have a bachelor's degree in computer science. In the case of artists, they'll probably have a Bachelor of Arts degree in some kind of arts-related field. And then typically they'll have some experience working at a lower level in the video game industry, maybe working on a mobile game or something like that before we hire them to work on a console game.
Okay.
So what kind of positions do you have at your company?
Well, there is the designers who design the game. There are producers, which is a very little understood field, but producers are critical because they're the ones that coordinate the contributions of all the different people that go into the game. So they're the ones that make the schedule. Like, okay, the programmers are going to implement this certain level of the game in March. So we need the art for the game ready in January so that they can be put in February, and the animators can work on it, and it's ready for the engineering department to work on in March. So all of that scheduling is done by the producers, and that's called production. We also have the engineers, or computer programmers as we call them. We have a wide variety of different artists. So we have modelers that will model real-world objects in 3 dimensions using little triangles we call polygons. And that's what game machines use to render a representation of each game frame. So that's kind of its own little skill. And so we employ modelers to do that. We have texture artists that will draw textures on these polygons to make it look like a real-world object, like that chair. They might put a texture that looks like leather on it. We have animators that make things lifelike, and human animation is the most difficult thing to do because it turns out our brains are really adept at identifying when something is not real. So to have an animation of a human look real is very difficult, so they have the training to do that. And then we have management. For example, I'm still the company president, and so it's my job to manage the business side of it, to make sure that we have enough income coming in to meet our payroll going out, to do all the tax filings and sign all the contracts and work with the legal department.
That's a lot of work between.
Yeah, it is. There's a lot that goes into it.
Yeah.
How long does it take to make and manufacture a video game?
It completely depends on the sophistication of the game. So for a very simple mobile game, it could be as short as 4 or 5 months. For a complicated console game, for example on the PlayStation 4, it might be 18 months. And then everything in between.
So how do you promote your games?
Well, there are different strategies. The one that we use is we mostly rely on word of mouth. We do games in what we call niches, market niches. So for example, our most popular game right now is a pinball game. We are the largest developer of video game pinball in the world, and we do recreations of classic pinball tables made by companies like Williams and Bally, Gottlieb and Stern, and we make pixel-perfect recreations of those tables on not only consoles but on phones. So you can play any popular pinball table that you can remember playing and seeing in an arcade, you can play on your iPhone. It's called the Pinball Arcade is our title. So that's a niche market for us, which means that there aren't very many people that make pinball video games. So we can identify that niche, and we know the people who like to play pinball, and we can market directly to them. That's much less expensive than doing a massive game that appeals to a wide variety of people like Fortnite, and then having to market to that wide variety of people.
Okay. Are there any upcoming releases you would like to share with us?
Well, we just actually, what is today? What day of the week is it? Is it?
It's the 2nd of November.
It's Friday. Okay, so today, actually, so today we are releasing our newest Nintendo Switch game. It's called Party Arcade, and it's got a bunch of party games like that you would play with groups of friends, like darts and shuffleboard and skee ball, and you can play with motion controls on your Switch. So we just released that today.
That's cool.
And then we'll be doing PlayStation 4 and Xbox One versions and PC version of that will launch in the middle of the first quarter, so about February or March.
I'll probably look out for it on PlayStation 4.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you to Jay Obernolte for being our first guest for the new season. For those watching this on YouTube, make sure to check us out on social media, and the links will be in the description box below.
Also visit Farside Studios online at farsidestudios.com.